Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we explore the complete history of Orgrimmar, the mighty capital of the Horde. From its founding in the red canyons of Durotar to the iron fortress it became, this city has witnessed the rise and fall of warchiefs, sieges that shook its walls, and the birth of a new era of leadership. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this tale unfold before you. Let yourself settle in now, finding that comfortable position where your body can truly rest. Take a slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, allow the tensions of the day to begin melting away. Tonight, we journey to a place of red canyons and ancient stone, where the Horde built their greatest city from nothing but dust and determination. This is the story of Orgrimmar. The tale begins in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction and unlikely salvation. The Battle of Mount Highjaw had ended, and with it, the threat of the Burning Legion's invasion. The great demon lord Archimond lay defeated, his essence scattered by the detonation of the World Tree Nordrassil's enchantments. Countless wisps had sacrificed themselves, channeling their energies into the ancient tree until the accumulated power consumed the demon in holy fire. But victory came at a tremendous cost. The Night Elves had surrendered their immortality to stop the Legion. The forests of Kalimdor still smoldered from demonic fire, and for the orcs who had fought alongside humans and night elves in this desperate battle, there remained the question that had haunted them since they first broke free of demonic corruption. Where would they go now? Where could a people who had been slaves, then invaders, then prisoners, finally call home? Warchief Thrall stood among his people as the smoke cleared from Highjaw's slopes, and he knew the answer. They would find their own land. They would build their own future. The old ways of conquest and demonic servitude were finished. The Horde would be reborn as something new, something honorable, something that Thrall's father Durotan would have been proud of. The journey began almost immediately. Thrall led his people northward through the wild lands of Kalimdor, a continent that most orcs had never seen before the Legion's invasion forced them across the sea. The Darkspear trolls traveled with them, their tribal chieftain Vol'jin having pledged his people to the Horde after Thrall saved them from destruction on the Echo Isles. And the Tauren, the noble bullfolk who wandered the plains of the Barrens, had also joined this new coalition after the orcs helped drive the centaur marauders from their ancestral lands. It was an unlikely alliance. Orcs, trolls, and Tauren had no history together, no shared culture or language. But they shared something more important. They were all peoples who had been pushed to the edge of extinction, who had survived against impossible odds, and who wanted nothing more than a place to live in peace. Thrall understood that this common ground could form the foundation of something lasting. The Tauren, in particular, proved to be invaluable allies. These noble beings had roamed the plains of Kalimdor for generations, following the herds and living in harmony with the land. Their chieftain, Cairn Bloodhoof, was a figure of immense wisdom and strength, respected not just by his own people, but by all who met him. When the centaur marauders had threatened to annihilate the Tauren completely, it was the orcs who answered their call for help. Thrall had led his warriors into battle against the centaur, fighting alongside the Tauren to drive back the horsemen who had hunted them for so long. The victory cemented a bond between the two peoples that would endure for decades. Cairn saw in Thrall a kindred spirit, a leader who understood that true strength came not just from military might, but from honor and wisdom. The Tauren brought their knowledge of the land, their connection to the Earth Mother, and their gentle strength to the new Horde. The Darkspear Trolls had their own story of salvation. Vol'jin's tribe had been driven from their home in the Eastern Islands by a variety of threats, eventually settling on a chain of small islands near the Maelstrom. When the Sea Witch and her Murloc servants attacked them, threatening to wipe out the tribe entirely, Thrall's fleet arrived just in time. The orcs fought alongside the trolls, defeating the Sea Witch and saving the Darkspear from extinction. In gratitude, Vol'jin swore an oath of loyalty to Thrall and the Horde. The trolls brought their unique skills to the Alliance, their knowledge of voodoo magic, their expertise as hunters and scouts, and their fierce warrior traditions. Though some in the Horde viewed the trolls with suspicion, the jungle trolls of the Eastern Kingdoms had been enemies during the Second War. The Darkspear proved their loyalty time and again. The orcs explored the northern reaches of Kalimdor for weeks, searching for the right place to settle. They passed through lush forests and barren wastes, crossed rivers, and climbed mountains. Some territories were too close to hostile Night Elf lands. Others were too far from water or too exposed to attack. The search was difficult, with the refugees growing weary after months of travel and conflict. Thrall consulted with his shamans and advisors, seeking guidance from both practical wisdom and the spirits of the elements. The elements themselves seemed to guide him, the wind whispering of open spaces to the north, the earth speaking of solid ground where foundations could be laid. Thrall had learned to trust these voices during his escape from slavery, when the elements had first answered his call, and he followed their guidance now. The expedition passed through the Barrens, a vast savanna that stretched for miles in every direction. Here the Tauren knew the land well, guiding the orcs past dangerous areas and toward reliable water sources. The journey was not without incident. Quilboar tribes attacked the traveling column. Centaur raiders struck at stragglers. But the combined might of orcs, trolls, and Tauren proved more than a match for these threats. And then they found it. A harsh, rocky land of red canyons and cracked earth where the sun beat down mercilessly and water was scarce. To many, it would seem an inhospitable place, a desert better suited to scorpions than civilization. But when Thrall looked upon this land, he saw something else. He saw a place that reminded him of the stories he had heard about Draenor, the orcish homeworld that had been destroyed by demonic corruption. He saw a land that would demand strength and perseverance from those who lived there. He saw home. The red rock of the canyons glowed in the setting sun as Thrall first walked this land. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass, of sage and iron. Eagles circled overhead, their cries echoing off the canyon walls. Scorpions scuttled among the rocks, and thunder lizards called in the distance. It was wild and harsh and beautiful, and it called to something deep within the orcish soul. This was a land that would not give its gifts freely, but would reward those strong enough to claim them. This was a land worthy of the new Horde, a land where their children could grow strong and free, where their ancient shamanic traditions could be rebuilt, where the shame of their past could be transformed into hope for the future. Some of the refugees wept when they saw this place, though whether from joy at finding a homeland or despair at its harshness, none could say, perhaps both. The elderly remembered lands they had left behind, first Draenor and then the eastern kingdoms. The young saw only opportunity, a blank canvas on which they could build a future, and Thrall stood among them, feeling the weight of their hopes and their fears, knowing that what happened next would determine whether his people survived or perished. Thrall named this land Durotar, in honor of his father Durotan, the chieftain of the Frostwolf clan, who had been murdered for opposing the demonic corruption of the old Horde. Durotan had been one of the few orc leaders to see through Gul'dan's lies and recognize the truth of what the orcs were becoming. He had tried to warn his people, and he had paid for that courage with his life. By naming their new homeland after him, Thrall ensured that his father's sacrifice would never be forgotten. But the city itself, the great capital that would rise from the dust of Durotar, would bear another name, a name that belonged to another hero, another orc who had shaped Thrall's destiny in profound ways. The city would be called Orgrimmar, in honor of Orgrim Doomhammer. Orgrim Doomhammer was a legend among the orcs, a warrior whose name inspired both fear and reverence. He had been the Warchief of the Old Horde during the Second War, the leader who had commanded the orcish armies in their battles against the alliance of Lordaeron. But Orgrim was different from those who came before him. He had killed the warlock Blackhand, who had served as the puppet of darker powers, and he had executed the traitorous Gul'dan's followers when he discovered the depths of their corruption. Orgrim was not a perfect leader. He had made terrible decisions and led his people to defeat, but he had tried, in his own way, to steer the Horde away from its darkest path. When Thrall had escaped from slavery as a young orc, when he had first found the scattered remnants of his people in the internment camps, it was Orgrim who had found him. The old Warchief had been impressed by this young orc who had been raised among humans, who had learned to read and write, who had trained in combat and strategy. Orgrim saw in Thrall the hope of a new generation, and he took the young warrior under his tutelage. Orgrim taught Thrall about orcish history and culture, about the shamanic traditions that had been suppressed under demonic rule, about what the Horde had been before corruption twisted it into something monstrous. And when Orgrim fell in battle, slain by a human knight's lance, while fighting to liberate orcs from an internment camp, he passed his legendary armor and weapon to Thrall. The young orc inherited not just Doomhammer, the legendary weapon that had shattered so many enemies, but also the mantle of leadership itself. Thrall kept Orgrim's armor, wearing it as a reminder of his mentor's sacrifice. He even preserved the hole in the backplate where the fatal lance had pierced, leaving it unrepaired as a memorial to how Orgrim had died. And now, in this new land, he would honor his mentor's memory by naming the greatest city of the Horde after him. The location Thrall chose for Orgrimmar was strategic and practical. The city would be built in the far north of Durotar, at the foothills of a mountain range that separated Durotar from the land of Azshara to the north. Several natural valleys had been carved from the mountains over countless ages, creating a network of defensible positions. The mountains themselves would serve as a natural barrier, protecting the city's northern flank, and the canyon walls would provide shade from the relentless sun while channeling the winds to cool the city streets. The construction of Orgrimmar began immediately, and it proceeded with remarkable speed. The orcs were driven by purpose, by the knowledge that they were building not just a city, but a future. Every stone they laid, every timber they raised, was a declaration that they were here to stay. They worked from dawn until dusk, breaking only for meals and the briefest rest. The labor was backbreaking. The sun of Durotar showed no mercy, its heat pressing down on workers like a physical weight. Water had to be carefully rationed, with breaks scheduled to prevent the workers from collapsing from dehydration. Some orcs died during the construction, their bodies succumbing to the harsh conditions. They were buried with honor, the first heroes of the new horde, their sacrifice remembered in songs that would be sung for generations. The materials for construction had to be gathered from the surrounding wilderness. Stone was quarried from the canyon walls, teams of orcs chipping away at the red rock with picks and chisels. Lumber was scarce in Durotar itself, so wood had to be imported from the forests to the north or purchased from goblin traders at premium prices. Metal was even harder to come by, with ore deposits jealously guarded and every scrap of iron precious. The orcs developed new techniques to work with what they had. They learned to build with dried mud and clay, materials that were abundant in the desert environment. They discovered which local plants could be woven into rope strong enough to haul heavy loads. They adapted their construction methods to the terrain, building into the canyon walls rather than on flat ground, using the natural rock formations as foundations for their structures. But the orcs did not build alone. The Darkspear trolls contributed their labor and their knowledge of construction in tropical environments. The Tauren, who had joined the Horde after Thrall helped rescue their leader, Cairn Bloodhoof, from centaur attackers, brought their strength and their connection to the earth. And the goblins, those clever green-skinned engineers who would do anything for the right price, provided their mechanical expertise and their understanding of efficient construction techniques. The alliance between orcs and goblins was purely transactional. The goblins of the various trade cartels had no love for the Horde, but they recognized an opportunity when they saw one. A new orcish nation would need supplies, equipment, and infrastructure. The goblins could provide all of this for a suitable fee. And so goblin engineers worked alongside orcish laborers, designing pulley systems and scaffolding that allowed the city to rise faster than anyone had thought possible. Rexar, the Moknathal champion, who was half orc and half ogre, also played a crucial role in the founding of Durotar. This solitary wanderer had initially wanted nothing to do with the Horde or any other faction. He preferred the company of his animal companions to that of other people, but circumstances had drawn him into Thrall's service, and his wilderness skills proved invaluable during the early settlement period. Rexar scouted the land, identified water sources, and helped establish safe routes between the growing settlements of Durotar. The architecture of early Orgrimmar reflected the practical needs and cultural values of its builders. The orcs constructed simple structures of wood and dried mud, buildings that could be erected quickly and would provide adequate shelter from the elements. Tall wooden towers rose at strategic points, allowing guards to watch for approaching enemies. The streets were unpaved, beaten into hard-packed earth by countless feet. There was nothing elegant about early Orgrimmar, but there was an honest functionality to every structure. The city grew organically around the natural features of the land. The largest valley, which would come to be known as the Valley of Strength, served as the main entrance and commercial heart of the city. Here, orcs gathered to trade goods, share news, and conduct the daily business of survival. A great gate was constructed at the valley's southern entrance, flanked by guard towers that could rain arrows down on any attacker foolish enough to approach. Other valleys housed different aspects of orcish society. The Valley of Wisdom became the seat of government, where Thrall established Garrosh Hold as his center of command. The name honored Garrosh Hellscream, the legendary chieftain who had finally freed the orcs from demonic corruption by slaying the Pit Lord Manoroth. Garrosh had died in that final battle, but his sacrifice had broken the blood curse that had enslaved his people for a generation. Within Garrosh Hold, Thrall would meet with his advisors, receive reports from across Durotar, and make the decisions that would shape the Horde's future. The Valley of Spirits became home to the Darkspear Trolls, who built structures reflecting their own cultural traditions. Troll architecture favored natural materials and flowing curves, quite different from the angular orcish style. The Trolls established shrines to their Loa, the spirits they worshipped, and their witch doctors practiced their ancient arts in the shadows. Despite the cultural differences, the Trolls and Orcs learned to live together, each respecting the other's ways while contributing to the greater community. The drag served as a passage between valleys, a narrow corridor lined with shops and services. Here, rogues and warlocks found trainers who could help them hone their darker skills. The Cleft of Shadow, accessible through the drag, became a gathering place for those who practiced the more shadowy arts. Even in this new, honorable horde, there was a place for those who worked in darkness, though they were watched carefully to ensure they did not return to the old ways of demon worship. The clans that settled in Durotar each brought their own traditions and strengths to the new nation. The Frostwolf clan, Thrall's own people, had survived in the frozen mountains of the eastern kingdoms by maintaining the old shamanic ways, even when such practices were forbidden. Their shamans were among the most powerful in the new horde, their connection to the elements serving as a model for others to follow. The Frostwolves established their primary settlement in the mountains north of Orgrimmar, where the cooler air reminded them of their long exile. The Warsong clan, fierce warriors who had been led by Garrosh Hellscream himself, settled in the forested region of Ashenvale to the northwest. Their task was perhaps the most dangerous, securing lumber for the Horde's construction projects from lands that the Night Elves considered sacred. This would lead to conflict, as the Warsong's need for resources clashed directly with the Night Elves' determination to protect their forests. Garrosh Hellscream had died freeing the orcs from demonic corruption, and his warriors honored his memory by throwing themselves into their work with characteristic ferocity. The Shattered Hand clan, known for their brutal traditions and their custom of replacing one hand with a weapon, found a place in Orgrimmar's military structure. Their fighters served as elite shock troops, their willingness to sacrifice for victory making them valuable in the desperate battles that defined the Horde's early years in Kalimdor. The Bleeding Hollow clan brought their own traditions of sacrifice and divination, their spiritual practices adding another dimension to the Horde's cultural tapestry. Many smaller clans and scattered survivors also made their way to Durotar. Orcs who had survived the internment camps, who had hidden in the wilderness of the eastern kingdoms, who had escaped from various prisons and work gangs. All of them heard the call of the new Horde and came to join Thrall's vision. Some brought skills and knowledge from their time among humans. Others brought only their strength and their determination. All were welcome in Orgrimmar. The resources of Durotar were scarce, but sufficient for those willing to work for them. The red rock of the canyons yielded iron and copper when properly mined. The sparse vegetation supported small herds of swine and the hardy boars that roamed the wilderness. Hunters tracked the various beasts that made their homes in the canyons, providing meat and leather for the growing population. Fishermen cast their nets in the waters off the coast, though they had to be wary of the hostile creatures that lurked beneath the waves. Water was the most precious resource of all. The South Fury River flowed along the western border of Durotar, providing a reliable source of fresh water for those settlements close enough to access it. Underground springs fed wells that had been dug throughout the region, their locations jealously guarded and carefully maintained. The shamans worked to keep the water flowing, communing with the water spirits to ensure that the land could support its growing population. Agriculture in Durotar was a constant struggle. The soil was thin and rocky, baked hard by the relentless sun. Traditional orcish farming techniques, developed on the very different terrain of Draenor, had to be adapted to these new conditions. The orcs learned to work with the land rather than against it, planting crops that could survive the heat and harvesting the native plants that had evolved to thrive in the harsh environment. Cacti provided moisture and food. Certain fungi grew in the shadowy caves and were cultivated for their nutritional value. Every resource was used, nothing wasted. But Durotar was not a peaceful land, and the early settlers faced constant threats. The Quillboar, those bristled boar folk who inhabited the thorny regions to the south and west, resented the orcish presence in what they considered their territory. They launched raid after raid against orcish settlements, emerging from their thorny mazes to attack travelers and outlying farms. The battles against the Quillboar were fierce and ongoing, with neither side willing to give ground. The centaur, those half-horse creatures who had terrorized the Tauren for generations, also proved to be a constant danger. Though the main centaur tribes had been driven back, smaller bands still raided across the borders of Durotar, stealing livestock and killing any orc they caught alone. The harpy covens that nested in the mountain peaks descended to snatch unwary travelers, carrying them off to their eyries for purposes too grim to describe. And scattered across the land were thunder lizards, massive beasts that could crush an orc with a single step and whose roars could be heard for miles. Perhaps most troubling were the orcs who had refused to abandon the old ways. Some warlocks, corrupted by demonic power, had fled into the wilderness rather than submit to Thrall's new order. They established hidden camps in caves and canyons, practicing their fey magic and dreaming of returning the Horde to its former dark glory. These traitors posed a constant threat, attempting to recruit the dissatisfied and the desperate while plotting against Thrall's rule. Young orcs were sent to the Valley of Trials, a harsh region near the city where they would prove themselves worthy of joining the Horde. Here they faced tests of strength, courage, and wisdom. They fought scorpions and boars, learned to survive in the unforgiving land, and discovered whether they had what it took to be true members of their people. Those who passed these trials emerged stronger and more confident, ready to contribute to the growing nation. Those who failed were given additional training, for Thrall believed that every orc deserved the chance to find their strength. Despite these challenges, Orgrimmar grew. More orcs arrived from across Azeroth, survivors who had escaped the internment camps or who had been hiding in the wilderness since the Second War's end. The Darkspear brought more of their kin from the scattered islands where they had taken refuge. Tauren caravans arrived carrying goods and new settlers, their great Kodo beasts laden with supplies. Within months, Orgrimmar had transformed from a collection of crude shelters into a proper city, rough and unfinished, but unmistakably permanent. Thrall worked tirelessly during this period, dividing his attention between political leadership and spiritual growth. He continued to study shamanism, deepening his connection to the elements that had first answered his call during his escape from slavery. The elements of Durotar were different from those he had known in the eastern kingdoms. The fire here was hotter and more aggressive, reflecting the sun's relentless assault. The earth was dry and stubborn, yielding only to those who approached it with patience and respect. The water was precious and scarce, found in hidden springs and underground rivers that had to be sought with care. And the air carried dust and heat, whispering of vast open spaces and freedom. Thrall appointed trusted advisors to help him govern. The elder Farseer Zor Lonetree provided spiritual guidance, interpreting the messages of the elements and the ancestors. Vol'jin offered counsel on military matters and represented the interests of the trolls within the Horde. Various chieftains and veterans from the Second War brought their experience to discussions of defense and expansion. Together, they began to establish the institutions that would govern the new nation. But peace was not yet within reach. A shadow from the past was approaching Durotar's shores, a threat that would test the young nation's unity and force Thrall to make difficult decisions about the limits of reconciliation. Admiral Proudmoore was a hero of the Alliance, a legendary naval commander who had led the fleets of Kultiras against the Horde during the Second War. He was also a grieving father. His son Derek had died during a naval battle against the Horde, killed by red dragons that the orcs had enslaved and forced to fight for them. Dalen had never forgotten or forgiven. His hatred for the orcs had festered for years, growing stronger even as the world moved on. When Dalen learned that his daughter Jaina was alive and leading human survivors in Kalimdor, he sailed across the Great Sea to find her. But when he discovered that Jaina had established a truce with the Horde, that she had actually fought alongside orcs against the Burning Legion, his rage knew no bounds. He saw only the monsters who had killed his son, the savages who had devastated the eastern kingdoms. The idea that they could change, that they deserved a chance at peace, was inconceivable to him. Dalen seized control of Jaina's forces in Theramore and launched a full-scale invasion of Durotar. His fleet was one of the finest in the Alliance, crewed by experienced sailors and marines who shared their admiral's hatred of orcs. They established a blockade around the coast of Durotar, cutting off the Horde from maritime trade and trapping the Darkspear trolls on the Echo Isles. The assault on Durotar was devastating. Alliance forces pushed inland, capturing strategic positions and establishing fortified camps. Orcish patrols were ambushed and destroyed. Supply lines were cut. The threat was perhaps the greatest the young nation had faced since its founding, coming not from monsters or demons, but from well-organized military forces with superior naval power. Thrall had hoped to avoid this conflict. He sent messengers to Dalen, trying to negotiate a peace. He reminded the admiral of the Battle of Mount Hejal, where orcs and humans had fought side by side against the Legion. He appealed to reason, pointing out that neither faction could afford another war while Kalimdor remained wild and dangerous. But Dalen refused to listen. To him, the only good orc was a dead orc, and he would not rest until Durotar was purged of what he saw as monsters. Jaina Proudmoore found herself caught between loyalty to her father and her commitment to peace. She had seen the orcs fight with honor at Mount Hejal. She had spoken with Thrall and recognized him as a leader of wisdom and integrity. She knew that her father's war was unjust, driven by grief and hatred rather than any real threat. But Dalen was her father, the man who had raised her, and she loved him despite his flaws. In the end, Jaina made an impossible choice. She refused to help her father's war effort, and she refused to interfere when the Horde organized its counterattack. She stood aside, unable to fight against her own blood, but unwilling to support an unjust war. The counteroffensive was led by Rexxar, the Mok'Nathal champion, who had been living peacefully in the wilderness until the invasion forced him to action. Rexxar organized scattered orcish forces, recruited allies from among the Tauren and Trolls, and methodically dismantled the Alliance positions. He proved to be a brilliant tactician as well as a powerful warrior, outmaneuvering the Alliance at every turn. The decisive battle came at Theramore itself. Horde forces, supported by goblin-built warships, broke through the Alliance blockade and stormed the city's gates. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with neither side willing to yield. But in the end, the Horde proved victorious. Rexxar confronted Dalen in the ruins of Theramore's harbor, and the old admiral fell in combat, still cursing the orcs with his dying breath. Jaina wept for her father, but she did not seek revenge. She understood that Dalen had brought this fate upon himself, that his hatred had blinded him to the possibility of peace. Thrall offered her his condolences and his promise that the Horde would not attack Theramore. The two leaders renewed their commitment to peace, hoping that the sacrifice of Dalen Proudmoore would be the last casualty of the old hatreds. The survivors of Dalen's fleet sailed back to the eastern kingdoms, where they brought news of what had happened. The people of Kul Tiras were furious. They blamed Jaina for her father's death, accusing her of betraying her own blood. Rather than blaming Dalen for starting an unauthorized war, they saw only that a daughter had stood aside while orcs killed her father. Kul Tiras withdrew from the Alliance in anger, isolating itself and nursing its grudge for years to come. But for Durotar, the crisis was over. The Alliance threat had been repelled, and the young nation emerged from the conflict stronger than before. The orcs had proven that they could defend their homeland against a conventional military force, not just monsters and demons. The bonds between the Horde races had been tested and proven strong. and the legend of Rexxar, the lone champion who had rallied the defense, became part of Orgrimmar's founding mythology. With the external alliance threat diminished, Thrall could focus on building the nation he had envisioned. Trade routes were established with neutral ports like Ratchet, where goblin merchants were happy to deal with anyone whose gold was good. Farms and mines expanded, providing the resources the growing population needed. The city of Orgrimmar continued to expand, with new districts being carved from the mountainside and new defenses being constructed to ensure that the city could never again be threatened. But peace with the Alliance did not mean peace with all of Kalimdor's inhabitants. The conflict between the Warsong clan and the Night Elves of Ashenvale had been simmering since the orcs first arrived, and it would soon boil over into open warfare. The Warsong Outriders, led first by Garrosh Hellscream and later by his successors, had been tasked with harvesting lumber from the forests of Ashenvale. The Horde desperately needed wood for construction, for shipbuilding, for 100 different purposes. The forests of Ashenvale seemed endless, stretching from horizon to horizon, filled with towering trees that had stood for thousands of years. To the Night Elves, those forests were sacred. The trees were not merely resources to be harvested, but living things to be protected. The Night Elves had dwelt in Ashenvale for 10,000 years, since the sundering that had shattered the ancient supercontinent. They had watched over the forests, tended them, protected them from threats both natural and supernatural, and now these green-skinned invaders were cutting them down with no regard for their significance. The conflict that erupted became known as the Battle for Warsong Gulch. It was not a single battle, but an ongoing war, a series of skirmishes and raids and full-scale engagements that would continue for years. The Silverwing Sentinels, Night Elf warriors sworn to protect Ashenvale, clashed repeatedly with the Warsong Outriders. Blood was spilled on both sides. Neither faction would yield. Thrall found himself caught between competing imperatives. The Horde needed resources to survive and grow. The forests of Ashenvale were the closest source of the lumber they required, but continuing the conflict with the Night Elves risked drawing the entire alliance into a war that the Horde could not afford. The truce with Jaina Proudmoore was valuable, but it would not survive if the Horde was seen as an aggressor in Kalimdor. The Warchief attempted to negotiate with the Night Elves, sending emissaries to speak of compromise and coexistence. But the Night Elves had long memories. They remembered Garrosh Hellscream's rampage through their forests during the Third War, when the fell corrupted chieftain had slain Cenarius himself, the demigod of the wilds. They had seen what the orcs were capable of, and they did not trust assurances of peaceful intent. The conflict was eventually contained rather than resolved. Both sides established military outposts in the contested region, and the fighting continued at a lower intensity. The Warsong Outriders continued their lumber operations, though now they had to fight for every tree they felled. The Silverwing Sentinels continued their resistance, harrying the orcish logging camps and ambushing supply convoys. It was an ugly, grinding conflict with no end in sight. For Orgrimmar, the Warsong Gulch conflict meant a steady drain on resources and warriors. Young orcs, who might otherwise have contributed to the growing city, were instead sent to fight in the forests. Lumber that was needed for construction had to be paid for in blood. The war cast a shadow over the Horde's early years in Kalimdor. a reminder that the world remained hostile even after the great battles against demons and Admiral Proudmoore had been won. The road had been hard, and harder trials would come in the years ahead. But for now, in this moment of peace and growth, the orcs could take pride in what they had accomplished. They had crossed an ocean, found a harsh and unforgiving land, and made it their home. They had built a city from nothing, formed an alliance of unlikely partners, and defended their creation against those who would destroy it. Let yourself drift now, imagining the red canyons of Durotar under a sunset sky. The guards on the walls of Orgrimmar look out over their homeland, watching for threats, but also admiring the harsh beauty of the land they have claimed. In the valleys below, orcs go about their evening routines, preparing meals, tending to children, settling disputes, and living the ordinary lives that seemed impossible just a few years before. This was only the beginning of Orgrimmar's story. In the years to come, the city would transform in ways its founders could never have imagined. But that is a tale for later. For now, rest in this moment of peace when a weary people finally found a place to call home. The years that followed the defeat of Admiral Proudmoore were a time of growth and consolidation for Orgrimmar. The city expanded beyond its original boundaries, with new districts carved from the mountain valleys and new structures rising to meet the needs of a growing population. What had begun as a desperate settlement became a true capital, the heart of a nation that stretched across the harsh lands of Durotar. The Valley of Strength remained the commercial and social center of the city. Here, the main gate opened into a wide plaza where merchants set up stalls to sell their wares. The auction house dominated one edge of the valley, a massive structure where goods from across Azeroth changed hands. Traders from neutral ports like Ratchet and Booty Bay traveled to Orgrimmar to deal with Horde merchants, bringing exotic goods from the eastern kingdoms and beyond. The bank stood nearby, its vaults protected by the strongest locks goblin engineers could devise, and guarded by elite Kor'kron soldiers at all hours. Inns offered weary travelers a place to rest, their common rooms filled with the sounds of conversation and the clink of tankards. Orcish grunts mingled with the higher-pitched tones of goblin haggling and the rhythmic chanting of Thrallish prayers. The variety of voices reflected the diversity of the Horde itself, a coalition of peoples united not by common ancestry, but by common purpose. The streets of the Valley of Strength never truly slept. At any hour of the day or night, orcs could be found going about their business. Warriors headed to the training grounds to hone their skills. Shamans sought quiet corners to commune with the elements. Young grunts ran errands for their superiors, learning the city by navigating its winding paths. And always, the guards watched from their posts, ever vigilant for signs of trouble. From the Valley of Strength, a traveler could reach the other districts of the city. To the north lay the Valley of Wisdom, which in those early years served as the governmental heart of Orgrimmar. Here stood the original Grommash Hold, a relatively modest structure compared to what would come later, but impressive nonetheless. The Hold served as Thrall's seat of power, where he received visitors, held council meetings, and made the decisions that shaped the Horde. Within Grommash Hold, the atmosphere was one of serious purpose. Thrall did not rule as a tyrant, demanding blind obedience, but as a leader who valued counsel and debate. His advisors gathered around a great table, discussing matters of state and offering their perspectives. The elder Farseer Zor Lonetree provided spiritual insight, helping to interpret the will of the elements and the ancestors. Vol'jin, the Darkspear chieftain, brought the perspective of his people and his considerable tactical wisdom. Various orc chieftains represented their clans, ensuring that all voices were heard in the governance of the Horde. Thrall himself was a unique kind of leader. Raised among humans, he had learned their languages and their ways. He could read and write, skills that were rare among orcs of his generation. He had studied military history and strategy, and he approached problems with an intellectual rigor that some of his more traditional warriors found strange. But he was also a shaman of considerable power, connected to the elements in a way that commanded respect from even the most skeptical veteran. And when the time came for battle, he wielded the Doomhammer with devastating effectiveness, proving that his scholarly tendencies had not softened his warrior's heart. The Valley of Wisdom also housed various spiritual and governmental facilities. Shamans maintained shrines to the elements here, and the sounds of their rituals could often be heard drifting through the mountain air. Scribes worked to preserve orcish history and traditions, recording the stories of the clans so that future generations would know their heritage. Diplomats met with representatives of other factions, negotiating trade agreements and territorial understandings. To the west, the Valley of Spirits served as the cultural center for the Darkspear Trolls. The Trolls had built their portion of the city according to their own traditions, creating structures that curved and flowed in ways quite different from the angular, orcish style. Water channels ran through the district, a reminder of the Trolls' island origins and their connection to the sea. Colorful banners and tribal totems decorated the streets, each carrying spiritual significance in the Trollish tradition. The Trolls maintained their own spiritual practices within the Valley of Spirits. Witch doctors brewed potions and cast hexes in shadowy huts, their work seen as both essential and somewhat unsettling by their orcish neighbors. Shrines to the Loa, the spirits worshipped by the Trolls, stood at significant points throughout the district. The deep, rhythmic sound of drums could often be heard echoing through the valley, accompanying Trollish ceremonies that celebrated their connection to their ancestors and their gods. Vol'jin led his people with a combination of wisdom and fierce loyalty to the Horde. He had been one of the first to pledge his tribe to Thrall's cause, recognizing in the young Warchief a leader who would treat the Trolls as true partners rather than subordinates. Vol'jin's counsel was valued in Grommash Hold, and his warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with orcs in defense of Durotar. The alliance between orcs and Darkspear was one of the strongest bonds in the Horde, forged in the fires of the Third War and tempered by years of cooperation. The Valley of Honor housed military and martial facilities. Training grounds sprawled across the valley floor, where warriors honed their skills under the watchful eyes of veteran instructors. The Ring of Valor served as an arena where combatants could test themselves against worthy opponents, fighting for glory and the chance to prove their worth. The sounds of clashing weapons and bellowed war cries filled the air from dawn until dusk, as generation after generation of Horde warriors prepared for the battles to come. The drag served as a connecting passage between the major valleys, a long corridor carved through the mountain rock. The streets here were narrower and darker than in the main valleys, creating an atmosphere that attracted certain types of businesses. Specialty shops lined the drag, selling exotic goods and services that might not be welcome in more respectable districts. Rogues found trainers here who could help them perfect their shadowy arts. Alchemists offered potions of questionable origin, and the Cleft of Shadow, accessible through a tunnel from the drag, served as a gathering place for those who practiced the darker magics. The Cleft of Shadow was a place of whispers and secrets. Here, warlocks studied their forbidden arts under careful supervision, their powers harnessed for the Horde's benefit, while their darker impulses were kept in check. The practice of demonic magic was tolerated rather than celebrated, a necessary evil in a world full of threats that required every available weapon. Thrall knew that completely banning warlock magic would only drive its practitioners underground, where they could not be monitored. Better to keep them within the Horde, using their powers for the common good, while preventing them from returning to the corrupted ways of the old days. Rogues also found a home in the Cleft of Shadow, learning the arts of stealth and assassination from masters who had practiced these skills since before the First War. The rogue's path was not an honorable one in the traditional orcish sense, but it was recognized as necessary. Spies gathered information that saved lives. Assassins eliminated threats before they could harm innocents. The shadows had their place in the Horde's arsenal, as long as those who walked in darkness remained loyal to the light of the Warchief's vision. Daily life in Orgrimmar followed rhythms established by necessity and tradition. The city awoke with the sun, its streets filling with vendors setting up their stalls, workers heading to their jobs, and patrols changing shifts. The morning hours were devoted to commerce and labor, with the busiest trading happening in the Valley of Strength. As the day progressed and the sun climbed higher, many retreated to the shade of indoor spaces, waiting out the hottest hours in the cooler interiors of the stone buildings. The afternoon brought a second wave of activity as the heat began to fade and the city emerged from its midday rest. Training grounds filled with warriors, shamans performed rituals, and as the sun set, painting the red canyons in shades of orange and purple, the city's social life reached its peak. Inns filled with revelers sharing stories over drinks. Musicians played traditional songs, and the elders gathered to tell the old tales, ensuring that the next generation understood where they came from. Thrall worked to establish traditions and institutions that would outlast his own lifetime. He understood that the Horde was still young, still finding its identity as something other than a tool of demonic conquest. The orcs needed a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, a vision of what they could become. Thrall offered them that vision, a Horde based on honor and strength, where warriors were judged by their deeds rather than their bloodline, where different races could work together as equals, and where the shamanic traditions that had been suppressed under demonic rule could flourish once again. The shamans became the spiritual backbone of the new Horde. They communed with the elements, interpreting their messages and channeling their power. They blessed new construction projects, asking the earth's permission before breaking ground. They called rains during droughts and calmed storms that threatened the city. And they taught young orcs the ways of their ancestors, ensuring that the connection to the land and the spirits would not be forgotten. This was Orgrimmar in its youth, a city finding its shape, its purpose, its identity. The foundations laid in these years would support everything that came after, for better and for worse. The world beyond Durotar continued to evolve, and Orgrimmar's role in that world grew with each passing year. The Dark Portal, that terrible gateway between Azeroth and the shattered world of Outland, had been dormant since the end of the Second War, but reports began to filter back to Orgrimmar of strange disturbances, of demonic energies gathering around the portal's ruins. Something was coming, and the Horde needed to be prepared. When the portal finally reopened, disgorging a horde of FL orcs and demons, the Horde was ready to meet the threat. Warriors from Orgrimmar marched to the blasted lands, joining with Alliance forces in an unlikely alliance against the common enemy. The invasion was repelled, but it became clear that simply defending the portal was not enough. The threat had to be addressed at its source. The campaign in Outland was a strange journey for the orcs of Orgrimmar. This was the shattered remnant of Draenor, their ancestral homeworld, now a broken collection of floating islands hanging in the twisting nether. Some orcs found remnants of their heritage here, encountering the Maghar, brown-skinned orcs who had never drunk the demon blood and thus never succumbed to the corruption. Others simply saw the consequences of the old Horde's folly, the destruction that demonic power had wrought upon their original home. For the older orcs who remembered Draenor before its destruction, the experience was deeply emotional. Here were the remnants of lands they had known in their youth, now twisted and broken almost beyond recognition. The Hellfire Peninsula, once the verdant Tanaan jungle, was a blasted wasteland of red rock and fell corruption. Nagrand alone retained some of its original beauty, its floating islands and verdant plains, a reminder of what all of Draenor had once been. The younger orcs, those born in the internment camps or in the new lands of Kalimdor, approached Outland differently. For them, it was not a lost home, but a lesson in what could happen when power was pursued without wisdom. They walked among the ruins of orcish civilization and saw what their ancestors' choices had cost. The experience shaped them, reinforcing Thrall's teachings about honor and restraint. The Horde established major bases throughout Outland, from Thrallmar in Hellfire Peninsula to Garadar in Nagrand. They fought against the Burning Legion, against Illidan's forces, against the remnants of fell orcs who still served demonic masters. The battles were fierce and costly, but they served a purpose beyond mere military victory. By fighting to cleanse their ancestral homeland of demonic taint, the orcs of the Horde were symbolically rejecting the corruption that had once enslaved their race. Thrall led expeditions personally, his shamanic connection to the elements proving invaluable in understanding the alien landscape of Outland. He encountered the spirits of orcish ancestors, learned forgotten techniques from the old shamans, and came to understand more fully what his people had lost when they turned to demons. The experience deepened his commitment to the new path he had set for the Horde, confirming that he had been right to reject the demonic corruption that had nearly destroyed his race. The Outland campaign also brought new allies and new challenges. The Blood Elves of Quel'Thalas formally joined the Horde during this period, their addiction to arcane magic making them pariahs among the Alliance they had once helped found. These were a proud people, survivors of the Scourge invasion that had devastated their kingdom and killed most of their population. They had renamed themselves from High Elves to Blood Elves in memory of their fallen, and they struggled with a magical addiction that had been left unfilled since the destruction of the Sunwell. Lady Liadrin and her Blood Knights brought powerful magic to the Horde's arsenal, though their methods made some traditional orcs uneasy. The Blood Knights had originally derived their power by draining a captive Naru, a being of pure light, a practice that many found disturbing. But the Blood Elves were pragmatists, willing to do what was necessary to survive. And in a world full of threats, the Horde needed every ally it could find. The integration of the Blood Elves into Horde society required adjustments, with Silvermoon establishing its own embassies and facilities in Orgrimmar. The cultural differences were significant. The Blood Elves were an ancient civilization with a history stretching back thousands of years, while the Orcs were relative newcomers to Azeroth. The Elves valued elegance, sophistication, and arcane mastery. The Orcs prized strength, honor, and shamanic tradition. Yet both peoples had known devastation and loss, and both were determined to rebuild. Blood Elf merchants and diplomats became a common sight in Orgrimmar's streets, their elegant robes and refined manners standing out against the rougher orcish culture. Some orcs resented these newcomers, seeing them as too soft and too arrogant. Others appreciated the skills and resources the Blood Elves brought to the Horde. Over time, mutual respect developed, though the two cultures would never fully merge. Meanwhile, transportation networks expanded to meet the demands of the growing Horde. Zeppelin towers were constructed outside Orgrimmar's gates, providing air links to the Undercity in the Eastern Kingdoms and other key Horde locations. The Great Oblivion-built airships became a common sight over Durotar, their propellers churning through the hot air as they carried passengers and cargo across vast distances. The world was becoming smaller, more connected, and Orgrimmar stood at the center of the Horde's transportation web. The defeat of Illidan's Stormrage and the securing of Outland marked the end of one crisis, but another was already looming. Reports from Northrend spoke of a new Scourge offensive, of undead armies gathering under the command of the Lich King. The frozen continent that had claimed so many lives during the Third War was stirring again, and this time the Horde would not wait for the threat to come to them. The war against the Lich King began with ominous signs. A mysterious plague spread through major cities, transforming those it infected into mindless zombies. In Orgrimmar, the guards struggled to contain outbreaks, quarantining the infected and destroying the turned before they could spread the contagion further. For a few terrifying days, it seemed that the Scourge might accomplish through disease what it could never achieve through direct assault. The infected were easy to identify once the transformation began. Their skin turned pale, their eyes clouded over, and they lost all capacity for reason or speech. But in the early stages, before the plague fully took hold, the victims seemed merely ill. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones succumbed. Children were separated from infected parents. The healers worked around the clock, but there was no cure for the Scourge plague. Once infected, death and undeath were inevitable. The plague was eventually contained through brutal measures. The infected were isolated in designated areas guarded by warriors who had orders to destroy anyone who showed signs of turning. The bodies of the dead were burned to prevent reanimation. It was a dark time for Orgrimmar, a reminder of how vulnerable even the mightiest city could be to the right kind of attack. Thrall ordered a full mobilization, sending Horde forces to Northrend to take the fight to the Lich King's doorstep. The war that followed was long and brutal, fought across frozen wastes and ancient ruins. The Horde established a major base at Warsong Hold in the Borean tundra, where Garrosh Hellscream commanded the initial assault. They also maintained forces at Vengeance Landing in the Howling Fjord, where Forsaken apothecaries conducted their own research into the plague. The frozen continent was unlike anything most orcs had ever experienced. The cold was brutal and unrelenting, cutting through even the thickest furs. The days were short and the nights were long, filled with howling winds and the groans of restless dead. The scourge seemed endless, waves of undead crashing against Horde positions day after day. The Horde fought alongside the Alliance in Northrend, though the cooperation was uneasy at best. Both factions recognized that the Lich King posed a threat to all living things, and neither could defeat him alone. But the old hatreds simmered beneath the surface. Skirmishes broke out between Horde and Alliance forces, even as the Scourge pressed its attacks. The Wrathgate incident nearly shattered the fragile cooperation entirely. At the gates of Icecrown Citadel, Horde and Alliance forces had assembled for a joint assault. High Lord Bolvar Fordragon and Dranish Sourfang, son of the legendary Varrock Saurfang, led their respective factions in the attack. They fought side by side, driving back the Scourge, until the Lich King himself emerged to face them. Then treachery struck. Grand Apothecary Putris, a forsaken scientist who had been secretly working with the Dreadlord Varimathras, unleashed a new plague on the battlefield. The blight killed Alliance and Horde soldiers indiscriminately. Bolvar Fordragon was engulfed in flames. Dranosh Saurfang fell and was raised as a Death Knight in the Lich King's service. The assault collapsed into chaos. The Wrathgate betrayal led to open conflict between the Alliance and the Horde. King Varian Rin, enraged by what he saw as Horde treachery, led an assault on the Undercity to kill Putris and Varimathras. Thrall also attacked the traitors, who had attempted to overthrow Sylvanas Windrunner and seize control of the Forsaken. The two factions came within moments of battle before Jaina Proudmoore intervened, teleporting the Alliance forces away before blood could be shed. The incident left scars that would not easily heal. Many in the Alliance blamed all Forsaken, and by extension all Horde, for the Wrathgate massacre. The trust that had been slowly building between the factions was shattered. Even after Putris and Varimathras were destroyed, the suspicion remained. Many orcs who left Orgrimmar for Northrend never returned. Their bodies were buried in the eternal ice of the north, or raised as the very undead they had died fighting. The war memorial in Orgrimmar grew longer, listing name after name of those who had fallen in the frozen continent. Families mourned, children grew up without parents. The cost of defeating the Lich King was measured not just in resources, but in lives. During the Northrend campaign, a new figure rose to prominence within the Horde. Garrosh Hellscream, son of the legendary Grommash, had been discovered living among the Maghar in Outland. When Thrall first met him, Garrosh was consumed by shame, believing that his father had doomed the orcish race through his demonic corruption. But Thrall showed him the truth. Grommash had died a hero, striking down Manaroth and breaking the blood curse forever. This revelation transformed Garrosh, igniting in him a fierce pride and an aggressive ambition. Garrosh proved himself an effective commander in Northrend, leading Horde forces to victory after victory against the Scourge. His aggressive tactics and unwillingness to compromise appealed to warriors who had grown frustrated with what they saw as Thrall's excessive caution. Where Thrall sought diplomatic solutions, Garrosh demanded military action. Where Thrall advocated for cooperation with the Alliance, Garrosh saw only weakness in working with the enemy. The tension between Thrall's vision and Garrosh's ambition would shape the future of Orgrimmar in ways no one could have predicted. But for now, the focus remained on defeating the Lich King. The Horde and Alliance, working in an uneasy parallel effort, pushed deeper into Northrend until they finally breached Ice-Crown Citadel and brought the war to the Lich King himself. The death of Arthas Menethil, the fallen prince who had become the Lich King, marked the end of the Northrend campaign. The Horde had suffered terrible losses, but they had proven themselves once again as a force to be reckoned with. As the survivors returned home to Orgrimmar, they found a city that had changed during their absence, and a world that was about to change even more dramatically. Thrall had always known that his duties extended beyond politics and war. As a shaman, he was connected to the elements of Azeroth, and he could feel that something was terribly wrong with the world. The earth trembled with increasing frequency. The elements were agitated, unresponsive to shamanic calls. Something catastrophic was building, and if it was not addressed, all of Azeroth might be destroyed. The source of the disturbance was Deathwing, the corrupted dragon aspect, who had been driven mad by the old gods. Once known as Neltharion the Earthwarder, this former guardian of the world had become its greatest threat. He had been healing in the depths of Deepholm, the elemental plane of Earth, and now he was preparing to return to Azeroth and remake it in his image of destruction. Thrall knew that the world needed him to fulfill his shamanic duties, but leaving the Horde without leadership was unthinkable. After much deliberation, he made a decision that would alter the course of Orcish history. He would step down as Warchief, passing the mantle to someone who could lead the Horde while he focused on saving the world. His choice fell upon Garrosh Hellscream. It was a controversial decision. Many within the Horde, including Cairn Bloodhoof and Vol'jin, questioned whether Garrosh had the temperament for leadership. He was aggressive, impulsive, and harbored deep hostilities toward the Alliance. But Thrall saw in Garrosh the qualities of a wartime leader, someone who could rally the Horde's military might while Thrall was away. He also hoped that the responsibilities of leadership would temper Garrosh's more extreme tendencies. Thrall was wrong. The transition of power coincided with Deathwing's emergence. The corrupted dragon erupted from Deepholm, tearing through the elemental barrier and unleashing destruction across Azeroth. The cataclysm, as it came to be called, reshaped the world. Coastlines crumbled into the sea. Volcanic eruptions destroyed entire regions. The very geography of Azeroth was transformed in an instant of apocalyptic fury. The citizens of Orgrimmar felt the cataclysm as a series of massive earthquakes that shook the city to its foundations. Buildings that had stood for years cracked and crumbled. The ground itself split open in places, revealing deep fissures that glowed with volcanic heat. For a terrifying few hours, no one knew if the world itself was ending. When the shaking finally stopped, the orcs emerged to find their world transformed. The South Fury River had changed course in places, its waters now flowing through areas that had been dry land. The coastline of Durotar had been reshaped, with new inlets and coves appearing where solid ground had once stood. The mountains that ringed Orgrimmar had shifted, opening new passes and closing others. The Barrens, the vast savanna that stretched south of Durotar, had been split in two by a massive volcanic fissure. Lava flowed where grass had grown. The great lift that connected the northern and southern regions was destroyed, cutting off communities from each other. Refugees from the devastated areas fled north toward Orgrimmar, swelling the city's population and straining its resources. Durotar survived the initial cataclysm relatively intact compared to many regions, but the world around it was transformed. New threats emerged from the chaos, and Garrosh saw opportunities where others saw only disaster. He immediately began reshaping both the Horde and its capital to match his vision of orcish supremacy. Orgrimmar underwent a total transformation under Garrosh's rule. The original city, with its wooden towers and mud brick buildings, was torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. Where there had been natural materials worked by hand, Garrosh ordered construction in dark iron and heavy stone. Massive metal spikes crowned the new buildings, a visible symbol of the Horde's martial strength. The fortifications were doubled and redoubled, with walls thick enough to withstand the most powerful siege weapons. The new Grommish hold was perhaps the most dramatic change. Garrosh moved the seat of power from the Valley of Wisdom to the Valley of Strength, constructing a massive new fortress that dominated the city's skyline. This new hold was a statement of power, its iron walls and towering spires visible from leagues away. Within, Garrosh installed the bones of Manaroth, the pit lord whose death had freed the orcs from their curse. The bones hung above his throne, a reminder of orcish triumph over demonic corruption. The symbolism was not lost on those who understood it. Garrosh was claiming the legacy of his father, positioning himself as the true inheritor of Grommish's heroic sacrifice. But the way he invoked that legacy spoke to his own darker impulses. Where Grommish had died seeking redemption, Garrosh seemed interested only in glory. The Zeppelin towers that had stood outside the city gates were demolished and rebuilt within the city walls, incorporated into a new structure called the Orgrimmar Skyway. This brought the transportation network under direct military control, allowing Garrosh to monitor and restrict travel as he saw fit. The message was clear. Nothing entered or left Orgrimmar without the Warchief's knowledge. The Valley of Wisdom was redesigned as a Tauren district, its architecture transformed to reflect their culture. Cairn Bloodhoof and his people were given their own space within the city, separate from the orcish majority. On the surface, this seemed like an acknowledgement of Tauren contributions to the Horde. In practice, it was the beginning of a policy of racial segregation that would become increasingly oppressive. The Valley of Spirits underwent a similar transformation, becoming explicitly a troll district with its own distinctive architecture. Water features were added to remind the Darkspear of their island origins, and troll totems decorated every corner. Vol'jin and his people were given autonomy within their district, but they were also increasingly marginalized from the central power structure. The Cataclysm also brought new members to the Horde. The Bilgewater Cartel, a goblin trade organization led by Trade Prince Gallywix, joined Garrosh's horde after their home island of Kazan was destroyed by volcanic eruptions. The goblins had been caught between the erupting volcano and Alliance naval forces, and it was Horde ships that rescued them from destruction. In gratitude and in recognition of the business opportunities that Horde membership offered, Gallywix pledged his cartel to Garrosh's banner. The goblins established their own district within Orgrimmar, a chaotic area filled with smoking machinery, explosive experiments, and the constant clamor of commerce. Goblin engineers and merchants flooded into the city, bringing with them their unique approach to problem solving. Where others saw obstacles, goblins saw opportunities. Where others worried about safety, goblins calculated acceptable risk margins. Their presence transformed Orgrimmar's economy, introducing new goods, new services, and new ways of doing things. The goblin slums, as some called them, sprawled across the eastern side of the city. Ramshackle structures leaned against each other at precarious angles. Steam vents hissed and pipes clanked. The smell of oil and gunpowder mixed with the scent of exotic foods from across Azeroth. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was alive with a chaotic energy that was pure goblin. Garrosh tolerated the goblins because they were useful. Their engineering expertise helped construct the new fortifications. Their merchant networks brought resources that the Horde needed, and their complete lack of moral scruples made them willing to undertake tasks that others might refuse. The goblins, for their part, were happy to work for whoever paid them, and Garrosh paid well for loyalty. Garrosh's vision of the Horde was fundamentally different from Thrall's. Where Thrall had emphasized unity among different races, Garrosh believed in orcish supremacy. He saw the other races of the Horde as useful tools at best, potential threats at worst. The Blood Elves were too foreign, their magical traditions at odds with the warrior culture Garrosh championed. The Trolls were acceptable allies, but not true orcs. The Tauren were respected for their strength, but their peaceful philosophy was seen as weakness. Only orcs, in Garrosh's view, truly understood what the Horde should be. This ideology was reflected in the new Orgrimmar. The city became a monument to orcish military power, its iron fortifications speaking to an aggressive rather than defensive posture. The emphasis on strength and conquest echoed the old Horde, the demon-corrupted war machine that had devastated the eastern kingdoms. Many within the Horde grew uncomfortable with the direction their leader was taking them, but Garrosh's control of the military made open opposition dangerous. The Kor'kron, the elite military force that served as the Warchief's personal guard, grew in power and influence under Garrosh. These warriors enforced the Warchief's will throughout the city and beyond, acting as police, army, and secret service combined. Those who spoke against Garrosh too loudly might find Kor'kron warriors at their door, asking pointed questions about their loyalty. Despite the growing authoritarianism, Garrosh did achieve some genuine successes. The new fortifications made Orgrimmar nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Horde military forces expanded significantly, with new weapons and equipment produced in the forges of the capital. and Garrosh's aggressive stance against the Alliance won support from warriors who had grown tired of what they saw as Thrall's excessive accommodation of their enemies. But the costs of this approach were becoming apparent. The Horde's other races felt increasingly marginalized. Traditional shamanic practices were de-emphasized in favor of military training, and Garrosh's provocations were escalating tensions with the Alliance toward open war. Cairn Bloodhoof, the elderly chieftain of the Tauren, who had been one of Thrall's closest allies, challenged Garrosh to Mak'gora, the traditional orcish duel of honor. He believed Garrosh was leading the Horde to ruin and hoped to remove him through legitimate means. But the duel was sabotaged. Magatha Grimtotem, a treacherous Tauren who sought power for herself, poisoned Garrosh's blade without his knowledge. Cairn was killed, and though the truth of the poisoning eventually came out, the damage was done. The death of Cairn shocked the Horde. This was no battle casualty or assassination by enemies. A founding member of the new Horde had died in a duel with its current leader, poisoned by treachery. Vol'jin confronted Garrosh openly, warning him that his path would destroy everything Thrall had built. Garrosh responded with threats, making clear that he would not tolerate dissent. Vol'jin withdrew from Orgrimmar, taking his trolls back to the Echo Isles and maintaining only the most necessary contact with the capital. The rift between orcs and trolls, one of the original alliances that had founded the Horde, was now open and growing. And still Garrosh pressed forward, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned by the damage he was causing. The world was changing, the Horde was changing, and Orgrimmar stood as the embodiment of that transformation. The city that Thrall had built as a home for a weary people had become a fortress for an empire, its iron walls reflecting the iron will of its new master. What would come next would shake those walls to their foundations. The discovery of Pandaria changed everything. This mist-shrouded continent had been hidden from the world for 10,000 years, protected by ancient magic that kept it beyond the reach of both Alliance and Horde. But the cataclysm had weakened those barriers, and when Horde and Alliance vessels crashed upon Pandaria's shores, they brought with them the old hatreds that had defined Azeroth for generations. Garrosh saw Pandaria as an opportunity. The continent was rich in resources, from rare minerals to powerful magical artifacts. It was also home to the Mogu, an ancient race whose technology and magic had created wonders beyond anything the modern world could match. And hidden beneath Pandaria's tranquil surface lay the remnants of the Shah, manifestations of negative emotions that had been defeated and imprisoned by the last Pandaren emperor millennia ago. The Shah were dangerous precisely because they fed on negative emotions. Anger, fear, hatred, violence. These were not merely psychological states, but actual power sources for these dark entities. And the arrival of the Horde and Alliance, with all their centuries of warfare and animosity, was like a feast for the Shah. They stirred in their prisons, drawing strength from every battle, every act of aggression, every moment of rage. Garrosh did not care about such warnings. He pressed his campaign in Pandaria with characteristic aggression, seizing territory and resources without regard for the consequences. His forces desecrated sacred sites, enslaved indigenous peoples, and committed atrocities that shocked even hardened veterans. And at the center of his ambitions lay the Veil of Eternal Blossoms, the spiritual heart of Pandaria, where an artifact of terrible power awaited. The heart of Y'Sharj was the remnant of an old god, one of the cosmic horrors that had infested Azeroth in its earliest days. The Titans had slain Y'Sharj eons ago, but its heart had survived, pulsing with dark power. When Garrosh learned of the heart's existence, he became obsessed with claiming it. In his mind, this artifact would give him the power to crush all opposition and forge the Horde into the dominant force on Azeroth. The excavation of the heart was a catastrophe. The moment Garrosh's forces disturbed the artifact, the Shah of Pride was released, corrupting the Veil and spreading its influence across Pandaria. The beautiful gardens and crystal-clear pools were transformed into a wasteland of corruption. The Pandaren who had tended the Veil for generations watched in horror as their sacred land was despoiled by outsiders who cared nothing for its significance. Garrosh brought the heart of Y'Sharj back to Orgrimmar, installing it beneath the city in a hidden chamber called the Underhold. There, surrounded by loyal followers and dark machinery, he began to tap into the heart's power. The corruption spread outward, affecting not just Garrosh, but the city itself. Orcs who came too close to the Underhold reported strange dreams, feelings of paranoia, and an aggressive rage that seemed to come from nowhere. The transformation of Garrosh was visible to all. His eyes glowed with the same dark energy that pulsed from the heart. His decisions became increasingly erratic, his pronouncements increasingly grandiose. He spoke of a true horde that would unite the world under orcish rule, with himself as its eternal leader. The other races of the Horde were nothing but tools to be used and discarded. The Alliance was to be exterminated, their cities burned, their people scattered to the winds. It was the bombing of Theramore that finally convinced Vol'jin that Garrosh had to be stopped. Jaina Proudmoore's city, the symbol of peace between the Horde and Alliance, was destroyed by a massive monobomb. The explosion killed thousands, including many prominent Alliance leaders and Jaina's closest friends. It was an act of war so devastating that it seemed designed specifically to ensure that peace would never be possible again. Vol'jin watched these events from the Echo Isles, his fury growing with each new atrocity. He had warned Garrosh, had told him directly that his path would lead to destruction. Garrosh had responded by sending assassins to kill him. The assassination attempt failed, but it convinced Vol'jin that half measures were no longer possible. Garrosh would not step down peacefully. He would not listen to reason. He had to be removed by force. The Darkspear Rebellion began quietly, with Vol'jin reaching out to other Horde leaders who shared his concerns. Bane Bloodhoof, who had become chieftain of the Tauren after his father Cairn's death, was eager to join. Lor'themar Theron, leader of the Blood Elves, had already been considering withdrawing from the Horde entirely after Garrosh had threatened to purge the Sunreavers from Dalaran. Even some Orcish leaders, those who remembered Thrall's vision of what the Horde should be, began to murmur against Garrosh. The rebellion moved carefully at first. Vol'jin established contact with the Alliance, negotiating a temporary ceasefire that would allow both factions to focus on the common threat. This was a delicate dance, as many Alliance leaders were understandably skeptical of any Horde overtures after Theramore. But Varian Wrynn, the High King of the Alliance, recognized that defeating Garrosh served Alliance interests. He agreed to coordinate efforts, though he made clear that this was a temporary alliance of convenience rather than true peace. The Darkspear forces struck first in the Barrens, seizing key positions and cutting off Orgrimmar from its southern supply lines. Garrosh's forces, expecting the attack to come from the Alliance, were caught off guard by this internal uprising. The rebellion quickly captured Razor Hill, establishing a forward base just south of the capital. The road to Orgrimmar was now contested ground. Within Orgrimmar, Garrosh tightened his grip. The Kor'kron patrolled every street, arresting anyone suspected of disloyalty. The Valley of Spirits was locked down, its troll residents treated as potential enemies. The Valley of Wisdom was watched carefully, its Tauren inhabitants under constant surveillance. Even orcs who had served the Horde faithfully for decades found themselves questioned about their loyalty to the Warchief. Thrall returned during this crisis, drawn back from his shamanic duties by the desperate need. He could not simply stand aside while everything he had built was destroyed, but he chose not to reclaim the title of Warchief, believing that the time for single rulers was past. Instead, he joined the rebellion as a warrior and advisor, lending his considerable power and experience to Vol'jin's cause. The siege that followed was the largest military operation in Orgrimmar's history. Horde rebels and Alliance forces surrounded the city, their combined armies dwarfing anything Garrosh could muster. But the iron fortifications that Garrosh had constructed proved their worth. The walls could not be breached by conventional siege weapons. The gates, reinforced with dark iron and ancient magic, withstood every assault. Orgrimmar had been built to withstand exactly this kind of attack, and it was doing so admirably. The only way in was through the harbor. Horde and Alliance ships broke through the naval defenses, landing troops on the beaches of Bladefist Bay. From there, the invaders had to fight their way through the city itself, battling Garrosh's loyalists in the streets and alleyways. The fighting was brutal and costly, with every block contested. The assault moved through the city in stages. First, the Gob Squad, a team of goblin demolitions experts, cleared a path through the outer defenses. Then, the main force pushed into the Valley of Strength, engaging the elite Kor'kron who defended the new Grommash hold. The battle raged through the Drag and the Cleft of Shadow, through the Valley of Honor and the approaches to the Underhold. The Underhold itself was the final obstacle. This underground complex, built as an arsenal and emergency shelter, had become Garrosh's last refuge. Here, surrounded by the dark power of the Heart of Y'Sharj and his most fanatical followers, the Warchief made his final stand. The champions of both Horde and Alliance descended into the depths, fighting through wave after wave of corrupted defenders. When they finally reached Garrosh, he was no longer recognizable as the orc he had been. The power of Y'Sharj had transformed him, granting him abilities beyond anything a mortal should possess. He called upon the shadows, summoned manifestations of dark emotions, and fought with a fury that seemed inexhaustible. The battle was long and desperate, with the very fabric of reality seeming to tear under the strain of the power being unleashed. But in the end, Garrosh fell. Weakened and defeated, stripped of the dark power that had sustained him, he lay before his enemies, awaiting judgment. Many called for his immediate execution. The Alliance had every reason to demand his death. Even among the Horde rebels, there were those who believed that only death could atone for his crimes. But cooler heads prevailed. Garrosh would stand trial, would face justice for his actions before a tribunal of all factions. This was not mercy, so much as necessity. The world needed to see that such actions had consequences, that leaders could not commit atrocities with impunity. Garrosh was imprisoned and transported to Pandaria, where his trial would be held. In the aftermath of the siege, Vol'jin was named Warchief of the Horde. Thrall himself made the nomination, placing his hands on the troll's shoulders and declaring him the leader that the Horde needed. It was an unprecedented moment. Never before had a non-orc led the Horde. But Vol'jin had proven his worth through action, and the assembled leaders agreed that he was the right choice. Varian Wrynn stood before the new warchief, sword in hand, and addressed the gathered horde. He acknowledged the atrocities that Garrosh had committed, the lives lost, and the trust broken. But he also acknowledged that the horde had turned against their own leader, had paid in blood to remove a tyrant. He was willing to give peace another chance, as long as the horde maintained its honor. The rebuilding of Orgrimmar began almost immediately. Gazlov, the goblin engineer who had helped construct the original city, was brought in to repair the damage from the siege. The underhold was sealed, its dark chambers cleaned of corruption and converted to less sinister purposes. The streets were cleared of rubble, and the wounded were tended to. Slowly, painfully, the city began to heal. Vol'jin ruled from Grommash Hold, but his leadership style was dramatically different from Garrosh's. He welcomed representatives of all Horde races into his councils, listening to their concerns and incorporating their perspectives into his decisions. The city guard was restructured to include members of every race, symbolizing that Orgrimmar belonged to all the Horde, not just the orcs. The policies of racial segregation were relaxed, with people free to live and work wherever they chose. The rebuilding of trust was a slow and delicate process. Many who had suffered under Garrosh's rule were hesitant to believe that things had truly changed. The trolls who had been marginalized, the Tauren who had lost their great chief, the blood elves who had been threatened with purges, all of them watched the new warchief carefully, waiting to see if his promises of unity would be kept. Vol'jin understood their caution. He did not demand immediate loyalty or punish those who expressed doubts. Instead, he demonstrated through action what kind of leader he intended to be. He consulted with the leaders of all Horde races before making major decisions. He visited the various districts of Orgrimmar, speaking with ordinary citizens about their concerns and needs. He worked to repair the relationships that Garrosh had damaged, rebuilding the bonds that held the Horde together. The Kor'kron, that elite force that had served as Garrosh's enforcers, was dissolved and reformed. Those who had committed atrocities were brought to justice. Those who had simply followed orders, believing they were serving the Horde, were given the opportunity to prove their loyalty to the new order. The new guard force that emerged was more diverse, drawing warriors from all Horde races, rather than being exclusively orcish. The physical scars of Garrosh's reign were harder to erase. The iron fortifications remained, practical defenses that would serve the city well regardless of who sat on the throne. The massive Grommash Hold that Garrosh had built still dominated the Valley of Strength, its architecture a permanent reminder of the dark years. Vol'jin chose not to tear it down. That would have been wasteful, and the Horde could not afford waste. Instead, he filled it with new purpose, transforming a monument to tyranny into a symbol of recovery. The Underhold, that secret chamber where Garrosh had stored the heart of Y'Sharj, was sealed and purified. The dark energies that had corrupted the space were cleansed by shamans and priests working together. What had been a site of nightmare became a memorial, a reminder of what happened when power was pursued without wisdom or restraint. But the peace was fragile, and new threats were already gathering on the horizon. The trial of Garrosh Hellscream never reached its conclusion. Before a verdict could be rendered, the former Warchief escaped with the help of an unlikely ally, a bronze dragon named Kairos Dormu, who had been corrupted by the infinite dragonflight. Using a shard of the Vision of Time, an artifact that allowed glimpses across the timeways, Garrosh fled to an alternate version of Draenor in the past. There, Garrosh found the Orc clans before they had drunk the blood of Manaroth. He warned his father's counterpart, the Garrosh Hellscream of this other timeline, about the demon's deception. He provided them with technology and weapons from the future, helping them forge an iron horde that was powerful without being corrupted. And he opened a new dark portal that connected this alternate Draenor to the Azeroth of the present day. The Iron Horde invasion was different from what had come before. These orcs were not mindless berserkers driven by demonic bloodlust. They were organized, equipped with advanced war machines, and unified under strong leadership. They poured through the dark portal, establishing a beachhead in the blasted lands before the Alliance and Horde could respond. Vol'jin declared war immediately, leading a Horde expedition through the portal to confront this new threat at its source. The campaign on alternate Draenor was long and costly, fought across alien landscapes that were hauntingly familiar to any orc who knew their history. Here was Nagrand, as it had been before the destruction, verdant and alive. Here was the spires of Arak, home to the Arakoa civilization. Here was Gorgrond, where the Botani plant creatures and the Gron giants waged eternal war. The Horde established a foothold at Frostfire Ridge, allying with the Frostwolf clan of this timeline. These Frostwolves had never experienced the corruption, had never been enslaved by demons. Their chieftain, an alternate version of Durotan, initially viewed the visitors with suspicion, but common enemies forged common cause, and the Frostwolves eventually joined the fight against the Iron Horde. Throughout this campaign, Vol'jin proved himself a capable warchief. He coordinated military operations across multiple fronts, maintained the alliance with the Alliance forces who fought alongside them, and made the difficult decisions that leadership demanded. The Horde's warriors fought with renewed purpose, their honor restored after the shame of Garrosh's reign. Garrosh met his end on Draenor, though not at the hands of those who had overthrown him. The former warchief, still seeking power, still pursuing his vision of orcish supremacy, was killed by Thrall in a final confrontation. The duel was not Mak'gora. Garrosh mocked the traditions he had once claimed to embody, and Thrall struck him down with the power of the elements. It was an inglorious end for one who had sought glory above all else. With Garrosh dead and the Iron Horde defeated, the expedition returned to Azeroth. Vol'jin and the Horde had proven themselves again, had shown that they could fight with honor and win. Orgrimmar welcomed its warriors home with celebrations that lasted for days. For a moment, it seemed that the Horde had finally found Its way had become what Thrall had always hoped it could be, but the world would not allow such peace to last for long. The Burning Legion had been defeated before, but it had never truly been destroyed. Across the cosmos, demonic forces gathered, preparing for one final, overwhelming invasion of Azeroth. When their assault came, it struck with a fury that made previous invasions seem like skirmishes. The Broken Shore served as the Legion's beachhead, a forsaken island off the coast of the Eastern Kingdoms, where the tomb of Sargeras had been opened by the traitorous orc warlock Gul'dan. Both Horde and Alliance launched a coordinated assault, their greatest champions leading the charge against the demonic horde. The battle was a disaster from the beginning. The Legion's forces were endless, with demons falling only to be replaced by more demons. The Horde and Alliance fought bravely, pushing toward the tomb, but the trap had already been sprung. Demon commanders cut off their reinforcements, surrounded their flanks, and began a systematic slaughter. Vol'jin fought in the thick of the battle, his spear finding demon after demon, but a Felguard's blade, coated in fell poison, found him first. The wound was not immediately fatal, but the poison was beyond any healer's ability to cure. Sylvanas Windrunner, the Banshee Queen who led the Forsaken, pulled Vol'jin to safety and ordered a retreat. The horn of the Horde sounded across the battlefield, calling the survivors to withdraw. The Alliance, who had expected Horde support for their own push, instead found themselves exposed and outnumbered. King Varian Wrynn fell on the Broken Shore, sacrificing himself to allow his forces to escape. The Alliance blamed the Horde for abandoning them, not knowing that Vol'jin lay dying aboard the retreating ships. Back in Orgrimmar, Vol'jin was carried into Grommash Hold. The greatest healers of the Horde attended him, but their efforts were futile. The fell poison had done its work too well. The Warchief was dying, and nothing could save him. In his final hours, Vol'jin received a vision. The Loa, the spirits that the Darkspear had worshipped for generations, spoke to him of what must come next, or so he believed. In truth, the vision was sent by Muezala, a treacherous death Loa who had been corrupted by darker powers. But Vol'jin, weakened by poison and desperate to ensure the Horde's future, trusted what he saw. The vision told him to name Sylvanas Windrunner as his successor. This was a shocking choice. Sylvanas was not trusted by many in the Horde. She was calculating, ruthless, and openly disdainful of the living. Her loyalty to the Horde had always seemed more a matter of convenience than conviction. Yet Vol'jin, in his final moments, called her to his side and spoke the words that would change everything. "You must be Warchief," he told her. "I never trusted you, and I never liked you, but you must be Warchief." Vol'jin died on the throne of Grommash Hold, his body carried outside the city for a traditional Darkspear funeral. The flames consumed his form as the Horde watched in mourning. He had been Warchief for only a short time, but he had restored honor to the position after Garrosh's corruption. Now that honor would pass to someone many feared would destroy it once again. Sylvanas Windrunner took up the mantle of Warchief with characteristic coldness. She issued orders efficiently, organized the Horde's response to the Legion invasion, and proved herself a capable military commander. Under her leadership, the Horde fought alongside the Alliance against the demons, putting aside their differences to face the existential threat. The campaign against the Legion took the war across Azeroth and beyond. Class orders, organizations that transcended faction lines, arose to wield powerful artifacts against the demons. Champions of both Horde and Alliance ventured to the shattered world of Argus, the demons' homeworld, to strike at the heart of the Legion's power. In the end, the Legion was defeated. Sargeras, the Dark Titan who had created the Burning Legion, was imprisoned by the Pantheon of Titans. The threat that had loomed over Azeroth for millennia was finally ended, but victory came at a cost. In his final act of spite, Sargeras had plunged his sword into Azeroth itself. The wound was catastrophic, leaking a powerful substance called azerite that would reshape the balance of power between Alliance and Horde. And Sylvanas, her eyes fixed on this new resource, began to plan. Azerite was the crystallized blood of Azeroth herself, the world soul that slumbered at the planet's core. It possessed incredible power, enough to power weapons, to heal wounds, to reshape the very nature of magic itself. Deposits of azerite began appearing across the world, wherever Sargeras' sword had caused the planet to bleed. Both Alliance and Horde scrambled to claim these resources, recognizing their potential to tip the balance of power. Sylvanas saw azerite as the key to Horde survival. The Alliance was larger, wealthier, and more technologically advanced than the Horde. In a prolonged war of attrition, the Horde would eventually be ground down and destroyed. But with enough azerite, with weapons powered by the blood of a world soul, the Horde could strike decisively and end the threat of the Alliance forever. At least, that was the reasoning she presented to her advisors. What Sylvanas truly planned, what dark bargains she had struck with powers beyond mortal ken, remained hidden behind her cold eyes and colder smile. The Fourth War was coming, and Orgrimmar would stand at its center. The War of the Thorns began with whispers and ended with flame. Sylvanas had been planning for months, positioning forces, gathering intelligence, and preparing for a strike that would reshape the balance of power in Kalimdor. Her target was Teldrassil, the massive world tree that served as home to the Night Elves, and her goal was nothing less than the elimination of the Alliance's presence on the continent. The build-up to war was felt throughout Orgrimmar. Soldiers mustered in the Valley of Strength, their weapons sharpened and their armor polished. Supply trains stretched from the city gates into the barrens and beyond, carrying food, weapons, and equipment to staging areas along the front lines. The forges burned day and night, producing the instruments of war that would be needed for the campaign ahead. Many within the Horde had questions about Sylvanas' intentions. The Warchief had never explained her full plan, even to her closest advisors. She spoke in generalities about securing azerite resources and eliminating threats, but the specific details remained murky. Some trusted that she knew what she was doing. Others worried that the Horde was being led into another disaster. The offensive was launched with devastating speed. Horde forces swept through Ashenvale and Darkshore, pushing the Night Elven defenders back toward Teldrassil. The fighting was fierce, the Night Elves defending their ancestral homes with fanatical determination, but the Horde had the advantage of numbers and surprise. Within weeks, they stood on the shores opposite the World Tree itself. High Overlord Varrock Sourfang led the Horde's ground forces in the campaign. He was one of the most respected warriors in the Horde, a veteran of countless battles who had served under multiple war chiefs. Sourfang had fought alongside Garrosh in Northrend, had witnessed Garrosh's descent into madness and had helped bring him down during the Siege of Orgrimmar. He believed in the Horde's honor more than he believed in any single leader, and he had accepted command of this campaign because he believed it could be won honorably. The official plan called for the capture of Teldrassil, not its destruction. Holding the World Tree hostage would give the Horde leverage over the Alliance, forcing them to accept Horde dominance as in Kalimdor. It was aggressive, certainly, but it was not atrocity. Saurfang could execute such a plan with a clear conscience. The campaign proceeded according to plan at first. Horde forces swept through Ashenvale and Darkshore, pushing the Night Elven defenders back toward the coast. Saurfang's tactical brilliance was evident in every engagement, as his forces outmaneuvered and outfought the opposition at every turn. Within weeks, the Horde stood on the shores of the strait that separated the mainland from Teldrassil. The plan called for the assassination of Malfurion Stormrage, the most powerful druid in Azeroth and the heart of Night Elven resistance. Without Malfurion, the Night Elves would lose hope, and Teldrassil could be occupied with minimal further bloodshed. Sylvanas and Saurfang tracked Malfurion to a confrontation in Darkshore, where the Archdruid's power was tested against the combined might of the Warchief and the High Overlord. Sylvanas struck Malfurion from behind, a treacherous blow that left him unconscious and vulnerable. She ordered Saurfang to finish the kill, to claim the honor of slaying the Alliance's greatest champion. But Saurfang hesitated, striking down an unconscious enemy. One who had been wounded through treachery was not honor. It was murder. The old orc found that he could not do it. Tyrande Whisperwind, Malfurion's wife and the high priestess of Elune, arrived in time to rescue her husband. They escaped, and Saurfang's hesitation had cost the Horde its key objective. Sylvanas was furious, but she did not punish her High Overlord. She had another plan in mind, one that would accomplish her goals through different means. Standing on the beaches of Darkshore, Sylvanas ordered the catapults to fire, not at the Night Elven defenders, not at military targets, at Teldrassil itself. The flames spread with supernatural speed, consuming the World Tree and everyone within it. Thousands of Night Elves, including civilians, children, and those too old or sick to fight, died in the inferno. The sky glowed orange for days, visible from Orgrimmar itself. Sylvanas watched the burning with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been something else entirely. Saurfang watched in horror. This was not what he had signed up for. This was not the Horde he had given his life to serve. This was the old Horde reborn, the demon-corrupted war machine that had devastated the Eastern Kingdoms. The honor he had fought to maintain, the redemption he had helped his people achieve, was burning along with Teldrassil. The Alliance response was immediate and overwhelming. Anduin Wrynn, the young king who had succeeded his father Varian, led a retaliatory strike against Lordaeron, the forsaken capital in the Eastern Kingdoms. Sylvanas, rather than allow the city to fall into Alliance hands, ordered it blighted with plague, making it uninhabitable for either faction. The war escalated with every passing day. Saurfang returned to Orgrimmar a broken orc. He had led the campaign that made the burning of Teldrassil possible. His hands were stained with the ashes of innocence. The honor he had prized above all else seemed like a cruel joke now, a pretty story that orcs told themselves while committing atrocities. When the Alliance launched an assault on Lordaeron, Saurfang fought in its defense. But when the battle turned against the Horde, when Sylvanas ordered the retreat and the blighting of the city, Saurfang chose not to run. He stayed behind, seemingly intending to die in battle against the Alliance. Instead, he was captured and imprisoned in the Stockade, the Alliance prison beneath Stormwind. For months, Saurfang languished in his cell, refusing Alliance offers of parole or cooperation. He was a prisoner by choice, punishing himself for what he had helped to do. Anduin Wrynn visited him personally, trying to understand this orc who had thrown away his freedom. What he found was not an enemy, but a soul in torment. Meanwhile, the Fourth War raged across Azeroth. Sylvanas pursued victory at any cost, employing tactics that horrified even her own supporters. She allied with dubious forces, experimented with raising the dead to replenish her armies, and showed no regard for the lives of her own troops. Her only concern was winning, and she seemed indifferent to what would be left when the war was over. In Orgrimmar, the effects of the war were felt in every district. Young orcs who had grown up in peacetime were conscripted into the military, sent to battlefields across both continents. Families received word that their sons and daughters had fallen in battle, their bodies left on distant shores or raised as undead to serve the enemy. The lists of casualties grew longer with each passing week. The economy strained under the demands of war. Resources that might have gone to improving life in Orgrimmar were instead diverted to the war effort. Food was rationed, luxury goods became scarce. The forges that had once produced tools and household items now churned out nothing but weapons and armor. The Forsaken presence in Orgrimmar grew during this period. Sylvanas brought more of her undead followers to the capital, ostensibly to help with the war effort, but also to ensure her control over the city. The living residents watched uneasily as dark rangers patrolled the streets, their empty eyes seeing everything and their loyalty belonging entirely to the Banshee Queen. Whispers of dissent began to circulate through the city's taverns and back alleys. Many questioned why the war was being fought, what victory would actually look like, whether the horde that emerged from this conflict would be worth saving. The Kor'kron, or what remained of them under Sylvanas's command, cracked down on such talk, but they could not silence every voice. Bane Bloodhoof, who had replaced his father as chieftain of the Tauren, began to have serious doubts about Sylvanas's leadership. When he learned that she planned to use Derek Proudmoore, the brother of Jaina, who had been killed during the Second War and raised as a Forsaken, as an unwitting weapon against his own family, Bane made a fateful decision. He returned Derek to Jaina, warning her of Sylvanas's scheme. Sylvanas discovered the betrayal and had Bane arrested. The Tauren chieftain was thrown into the cells beneath Orgrimmar, awaiting execution for treason. This was the final outrage for many within the Horde. Bane was one of the most respected leaders in the faction, a voice of wisdom and conscience. To see him condemned to death for an act of basic decency was more than some could bear. Saurfang learned of Bane's imprisonment from an unexpected source. Anduin Wrynn came to his cell with a proposal, worked together to rescue Bane and end Sylvanas's reign. The young king was offering an alliance with an orc, a partnership that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. But circumstances had changed. They had a common enemy now, and that enemy was the Warchief of the Horde. Saurfang was initially reluctant. Trusting humans had led to disaster before, but when Thrall arrived, having been contacted by both Anduin and Saurfang's own allies, the old warrior agreed to the plan. Together with Jaina Proudmoore and Matthias Shaw, the head of Alliance Intelligence, they infiltrated Orgrimmar and rescued Bane from the depths of the city. The rescue was just the beginning. Saurfang began to build a rebellion, reaching out to Horde leaders who shared his concerns about Sylvanas' direction. Thrall joined him, lending his considerable influence to the cause. Lorthamer Theron, leader of the Blood Elves, committed his people to the rebellion. The Darkspear, the High Mountain Tauren, the Nightborn, one by one, the races of the Horde began to turn against their warchief. Sylvanas' response was predictable. She fortified Orgrimmar, filled its streets with her loyalists, and prepared for the siege she knew was coming. The iron walls that Garrosh had built would serve her now, keeping the rebels out while she consolidated her power within. She believed she could outlast her enemies, could wear them down, and eventually emerge victorious. But Saurfang had no intention of repeating the Siege of Orgrimmar. That conflict had cost too many lives and caused too much destruction. Instead, he marched his rebel army to the gates of the city and issued a direct challenge to Sylvanas. Mak'gora, the ancient orcish duel of honor, where leaders settled disputes through personal combat rather than sacrificing their people in open warfare. If Sylvanas accepted, she would have to face Saurfang alone, without the advantage of her fortifications and loyal troops. If she refused, she would be seen as a coward, and her support among the more traditional warriors would evaporate. Sylvanas emerged from the gates of Orgrimmar, resplendent in her dark armor, her expression unreadable. She accepted the challenge with what might have been contempt or might have been anticipation. The two warriors faced each other before the assembled armies, the fate of the Horde hanging on the outcome of their duel. The fight began with Sylvanas pressing the attack, her supernatural speed and agility giving her an immediate advantage. Saurfang was powerful but old, his reflexes slowed by decades of warfare and the weight of his guilt. Sylvanas struck him again and again, each blow drawing blood, each exchange pushing him further toward defeat. But Saurfang was fighting for more than himself. He was fighting for honor, for the vision of the Horde that Thrall had first articulated, for the souls of those who had died because of what the Horde had become. When Sylvanas mocked him, telling him that hope was a lie, something stirred within the old warrior. "You cannot kill hope," Saurfang declared. "You failed to kill it at Teldrassil. You cannot kill it here." Sylvanas' expression twisted with rage. She had not fought this war for the Horde. She had not sacrificed thousands of lives for orcish honor or trollish tradition. She had her own purposes, her own agenda, and the Horde was simply a tool to achieve them. "The Horde is nothing," she screamed. "You are all nothing." The words echoed across the battlefield, heard by Horde and Alliance alike. In that moment, the truth was laid bare. Sylvanas had never cared about the Horde. She had used them, manipulated them, and now she discarded them. With a blast of dark magic, Sylvanas struck Saurfang down. The old warrior fell, his life ended by the same sort of treacherous power that he had refused to use at Teldrassil. But his death was not in vain. By forcing Sylvanas to reveal her true nature, Saurfang had accomplished what his rebellion could not. Sylvanas fled Orgrimmar, abandoning the horde she had sworn to lead. Her loyalists, stunned by her betrayal, surrendered or scattered. The gates of the city opened, and the rebel forces entered not as conquerors, but as liberators. The Fourth War was over. Saurfang's body was carried from the field with the honor. Thrall spoke the words of remembrance, praising his friend for giving everything in service to what the Horde should be. An armistice was declared, and both Horde and Alliance committed to hunting down Sylvanas for her crimes. Peace, fragile and tentative, had returned. In the days that followed Sylvanas's departure, the leaders of the Horde gathered at the Orgrimmar embassy to discuss the future. The position of Warchief had existed since the first Horde crossed through the Dark Portal, but that tradition had produced Blackhand, who served the demons. It had produced Garrosh, who nearly destroyed the faction from within, and it had produced Sylvanas, who had just confessed that she saw the Horde as nothing. Thrall stood before the assembled leaders, many of whom expected him to reclaim the mantle he had given up. He had been the greatest warchief in memory, the one who had founded Orgrimmar and created the modern Horde. If anyone should lead them now, surely it was Thrall. But Thrall shook his head. He had made a promise to Varrock Saurfang, a promise that he would not become warchief again. More than that, he had come to believe that the position itself was the problem. Giving absolute power to a single individual invited the corruption and tyranny they had seen too many times. The Horde needed a new kind of leadership. No more warchiefs, Thrall declared, no more tyrants. The Horde will be led by a council with all our peoples represented. The Horde Council was formed that day. Thrall would represent the orcs, but he would be one voice among many. Bane Bloodhoof spoke for the Tauren. Lorthamar Theron represented the Blood Elves. Rokan, who had been Vol'jin's trusted lieutenant, now led the Darkspear Trolls. Lillian Voss stepped forward to represent the Forsaken, who had been left leaderless by Sylvanas's betrayal. Gazlo, the goblin engineer who had helped build Orgrimmar, became the voice of the Bilgewater Cartel. G. Firepaw represented the Huojin Pandaren, while First Arcanist Thalyssra spoke for the Nightborn and Gayara for the Moghar orcs from alternate Draenor. It was an unwieldy system, requiring consensus and compromise rather than simple commands. But it was also a system that prevented any one person from leading the Horde to disaster. Each member of the council could check the others, ensuring that no decision was made without careful consideration of its consequences. The council's first challenge came almost immediately. The Helm of Domination, the artifact that controlled the Scourge, had been shattered by Sylvanas as part of her schemes with a mysterious entity called the Jailer. The mindless undead that had been kept in check by the Lich King now ran rampant across Azeroth, and several key leaders, including Thrall and Bane themselves, were abducted by the Jailer's forces. Rokan stepped up to lead Orgrimmar during the crisis, proving that the council system could function even when some members were unavailable. The Horde worked alongside the Alliance to investigate the Shadowlands, the realm of death where their leaders had been taken. Champions from both factions ventured into this strange afterlife, eventually confronting the Jailer and his plans to reshape reality itself. The campaign in the Shadowlands revealed many secrets. Vol'jin's decision to name Sylvanas as Warchief had been manipulated by Muezala, a Death Loa serving darker powers. Sylvanas herself had been pursuing her own agenda, but had eventually turned against the jailer when she realized the true cost of his plans. The leaders who had been abducted were rescued, and the threat of the jailer was ultimately defeated. When peace returned, the council reconvened in Orgrimmar to address the future. The Forsaken, who had lost their home when Sylvanas blighted Lord Aeron, needed a new beginning. Lillian Voss and Kalia Menethil, a former princess of Lord Aeron, who had been raised as a light-forged undead, worked to establish a new desolate council that would govern the Forsaken. They began the slow process of reclaiming and cleaning the ruins of Lordaeron, hoping to make it habitable once again. The discovery of the Dragon Isles offered a new opportunity for cooperation. When Abyssian, a black dragon who had lived secretly among the Tauren, approached the council with an invitation from the dragon aspects, the Horde saw a chance to build something positive. The council instructed the Reliquary, the Horde's archaeological organization, to work alongside the Alliance's Explorers League in a joint expedition. It was a small step, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the Horde approached its relationship with the Alliance. The Drakthir, an ancient race of dragon soldiers created by the Black Aspect Neltharion, emerged from their long slumber during this period. These beings had been created during the time of the dragon aspects, before the corruption of Neltharion into Deathwing. They possessed the ability to shift between humanoid and draconic forms, and their mastery of both magic and combat made them formidable additions to any faction. The Drakthir who chose to join the Horde were drawn by its values of strength, honor, and the acceptance of diverse peoples. They established a presence in Orgrimmar, their unique forms becoming a familiar sight in the city's streets. The Horde had always been a coalition of outcasts and survivors, peoples who had found strength in unity after being rejected or threatened by others. The Drakthir fit naturally into this tradition. The Dragon Isles expedition marked a new chapter in the Horde's history. When the ancient homeland of the Dragonflights awakened after millennia of dormancy, both Horde and Alliance sent expeditions to explore this mysterious land. The Council authorized the Horde's participation, seeing an opportunity to establish relationships with the dragon aspects and to discover what secrets the islands might hold. The expedition to the Dragon Isles was remarkable for its cooperation with the Alliance. Unlike previous conflicts over territory and resources, the two factions approached the islands with a spirit of cautious collaboration. There were still tensions and occasional skirmishes, but the overarching goal was exploration and understanding rather than conquest. The Reliquary, the Horde's archaeological organization, worked alongside the Alliance's Explorers League in many areas of the Dragon Isles. They studied ancient ruins together, pieced together the history of the Dragonflights, and uncovered secrets that had been buried for 10,000 years. It was a glimpse of what Azeroth might look like if the factions could truly set aside their differences. Under the Council's leadership, Orgrimmar entered a period of relative peace. The iron fortifications that Garrosh had built still stood, reminders of a darker time, but they now protected a city that represented unity rather than domination. The streets bustled with members of every Horde race, working together, trading, and building the future that Thrall had envisioned so many years ago. The wounds of the Fourth War took time to heal. Night elves had been offered the opportunity to reclaim Gilneas, the former Worgen kingdom that the Forsaken had conquered years earlier. It was a gesture of reconciliation, an acknowledgement that the Horde could not undo what had been done at Teldrassil, but could try to make amends. The negotiations were difficult, and trust was slow to rebuild, but the process had begun. Today, Orgrimmar stands as it has stood for decades, a fortress city carved from the red canyons of Durotar, home to the diverse peoples of the Horde. The architecture tells the city's history. The massive iron walls and spiked towers speak to Garrosh's militaristic vision, while the wooden structures that survived the reconstruction recall Thrall's original foundation. The Tauren district in the Valley of Wisdom features the softer lines and natural materials of their culture, while the Troll district in the Valley of Spirits echoes with the rhythms of Darkspear tradition. Walk through the city today, and you will see a living community of cultures and traditions. In the Valley of Strength, an orc merchant haggles with a blood elf noble over the price of exotic silks from Pandaria. A Tauren shaman sits in quiet meditation beside a fountain, communing with the water spirits, while the bustle of commerce flows around her. A goblin engineer demonstrates a new device to a crowd of curious onlookers, promising that this one definitely will not explode. The Flightmaster's post near the main gate is always busy. Wyverns screech as they launch into the air, carrying passengers to destinations across Kalimdor and beyond. The great beasts circle the towers of the city before banking away toward distant lands, their riders clutching the handles of their saddles and watching Orgrimmar shrink beneath them. In the drag, the shops that once catered primarily to rogues and warlocks now serve a broader clientele. Alchemists sell potions for every purpose, from healing wounds to enhancing strength to simply making food taste better. Enchanters offer to imbue weapons and armor with magical properties. And in the shadowy corners, those who still walk darker paths can find what they need, though the Council's guards keep a watchful eye on such activities. The Cleft of Shadow remains a place apart. Here, the warlocks still practice their arts, their power harnessed for the Horde's benefit, but never fully trusted. The demons they summon are bound and controlled, tools to be used against the Horde's enemies. But everyone remembers what happened when such power was unleashed without restraint, and so the warlocks work under careful supervision. The Valley of Honor still echoes with the clash of weapons as warriors train for battles that may come. The Ring of Valor hosts matches most evenings, drawing crowds who cheer for their favorite combatants. These fights are usually non-lethal, tests of skill rather than battles to the death, but they maintain the warrior spirit that has always defined orcish culture. Children play in the streets of Orgrimmar, a sight that would have been impossible during the darkest days of the Horde's history. Young orcs chase each other through the alleys, their laughter mixing with the sounds of the city. They attend schools where they learn reading and writing alongside combat training. They grow up in a world where the Horde means something more than war and conquest, where honor is about how you live rather than how many enemies you kill. The elders gather in the evenings to tell stories of the old days. They speak of Thrall's journey across the sea, of the founding of Orgrimmar, of battles fought and friends lost. They tell of the dark times under Garrosh and Sylvanas, cautionary tales about what happens when leaders forget what the Horde truly stands for. And they speak of hope, of the possibility that the future can be better than the past, that each generation can build on what came before. Grommash Hold remains the center of government, though it now hosts council meetings rather than the decrees of a single warchief. The bones of Manaroth still hang within, a reminder of Garrosh Hellscream's sacrifice and the curse that was broken. But the meaning of those bones has changed. They no longer represent orcish supremacy, as Garrosh intended. They represent liberation, the moment when the orcs broke free of demonic control and began the long journey toward becoming something better. The great gates of Orgrimmar open onto the dusty roads of Durotar, connecting the capital to the wider world. Zeppelins still fly from the skyway, though portals now provide faster travel to most destinations. The auction house in the Valley of Strength still bustles with traders from across Azeroth. The inns still ring with laughter and song, and the guards still watch from the walls, protecting the home that their ancestors built from nothing. What does Orgrimmar represent today? The answer depends on who you ask. For the orcs, it is a homeland, the place where a homeless people finally put down roots and built something lasting. For the trolls and Tauren, it is the heart of an alliance that has endured through decades of war and hardship. For the blood elves and goblins, the Nightborn and Maghar, the Pandaren and Drakthir, it is the center of a coalition that offers protection and purpose. For all the peoples of the Horde, Orgrimmar is a reminder of what they have overcome: the demonic corruption of the old Horde, the tyranny of Garrosh, the betrayal of Sylvanas. Each crisis nearly destroyed them, and each time they emerged stronger, more united, more committed to the ideals that Thrall first articulated in the aftermath of Mount Hyjal. The future remains uncertain. New threats will emerge, as they always do. The peace with the Alliance is fragile, held together by the weariness of war rather than genuine trust. And the council system, while preventing tyranny, also makes decisive action more difficult. But for now, in this moment of peace, Orgrimmar stands. And so our story comes to rest, like you in your comfortable place, letting go of the day's tensions. Imagine yourself on those walls as the sun sets over Durotar, painting the canyons in shades of orange and purple. The city below settles into its evening rhythms. Merchants pack up their stalls, warriors return from patrol, families gather for the evening meal. The great gates of Orgrimmar swing slowly closed as darkness falls, though the city itself never truly sleeps. Guards take up their positions along the walls, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of threat. Torches flicker to life along the main thoroughfares, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. The smell of cooking food drifts from countless kitchens, the scents of roasted meat and spiced vegetables mingling in the air. In the Valley of Strength, the last merchants finish packing their wares, calling out to each other as they secure their stalls for the night. The auction house quiets as the bidding ends and the final transactions are recorded. A few dedicated traders remain, hoping to catch late-night customers, but most head home to their families or to the inns where cold drinks and warm beds await. The inns of Orgrimmar come alive as the working day ends. The Broken Tusk fills with warriors, swapping stories of battles past and future. Hunters compare their catches, arguing good-naturedly about who took down the biggest prey. Young recruits listen in awe as veterans describe campaigns they can barely imagine, battles fought on distant shores against enemies both familiar and strange. In the Valley of Wisdom, the council chambers grow quiet as the day's business concludes. The leaders of the Horde retire to their quarters, carrying with them the weight of decisions made and those still to come. Thrall walks alone through the corridors of Grommash Hold, passing beneath the bones of Manaroth, pausing for a moment to remember all those who sacrificed so that this moment of peace might be possible. The Valley of Spirits transforms as night falls. The trolls emerge from the shadows, their culture more attuned to the darkness than to the harsh light of day. Drums begin to sound, slow and rhythmic, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Witch doctors brew potions by firelight, their shadows stretching long across the walls. The air fills with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting as the Darkspear honor their Loa. The children of Orgrimmar are called in from their play, ushered to bed by patient parents who remember darker times. Mothers sing ancient lullabies, songs that their mothers sang to them, songs that carry the history and hope of the Orcish people. Fathers check the locks on doors and windows, a habit born from years of uncertainty, before settling into chairs to enjoy a few quiet moments of peace. Somewhere in the Valley of Spirits, a troll drummer begins a slow, soothing rhythm. The sound drifts up through the streets, mixing with the evening wind. Other drums join in, creating a gentle pulse that seems to echo the heartbeat of the city itself. It is a sound of peace, of home, of belonging. The city that rose from dust and determination, that survived siege and betrayal, that transformed from fortress to family, rests easy tonight. The stars appear above Durotar, the same stars that have watched over this land since before the orcs arrived, since before humans walked Azeroth, since the Titans first shaped this world. They shine down on Orgrimmar with ancient light, witnesses to all that has passed and all that is yet to come. The moon rises over the eastern mountains, casting silver light across the red canyons, painting the city in shades of shadow and moonbeam. In homes throughout Orgrimmar, candles are extinguished and fires banked for the night. The day's labors are done. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chapters in the endless story of the Horde. But for now, in this quiet moment, there is only rest. The guards continue their watch, their vigilance protecting the sleep of thousands. The shamans maintain their communion with the elements, ensuring that the land remains in balance. The council members dream of a future where peace might be more than a temporary respite between wars. And throughout the city, in hovels and halls, in barracks and bedrooms, the peoples of the Horde sleep the sleep of those who have earned their rest. And so can you. Let your breathing slow, let your thoughts quiet, let the story of Orgrimmar carry you into peaceful dreams. Think of the red canyons under starlight, of the drums that beat like a heartbeat, of the home that was built from nothing by those who had lost everything. Think of strength and honor, of unity and hope, of the bonds that connect all the peoples of the Horde. Tomorrow the sun will rise again over Durotar. The gates will open, the merchants will call out their wares, the warriors will train, the children will play. Life will continue, as it always has, as it always will. But for now, for this peaceful night, rest. Thank you for joining us for this journey through the history of Orgrimmar. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration of Warcraft lore, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps us create more content like this. Until next time, sleep well, champion, for the Horde.